The half-orc woman was told no one would want her after the breaking, least of all a human farmer in the borderlands. She was told wrong, because the one farmer who mattered didn't need a wife to bear more children. He needed someone who would help him raise his own. Her name was Grusha, and she stood in the rain with everything she had left in the world. A boy of 8 clutching her hand, a girl of 5 asleep on her back, and the clothes clinging to her skin like a second, colder layer of shame. The mud of the trackway sucked at her worn boots, a greedy, final insult at the end of a 3-day walk from the stony hills of her clan's territory. Each squelching step was a reminder of the words that had cast her out. Barren, broken, useless. She carried them now, heavier than the child on her back. Ahead, a single light burned in the window of a farmhouse, a pinprick of impossible warmth in the grey wash of twilight. This was the last farm before the road dwindled into nothing, the last chance. Her son, Kale, shivered, his small hand a block of ice in hers. He didn't complain. At 8 years old, he had already learned that silence was a shield. On her back, Ilara stirred, her small sigh a puff of warm air against Grusha's neck. They needed shelter, just warmth. She didn't dare hope for more. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? The farm was quiet, too quiet. A well-tended field of late-season cabbage glistened under the downpour, the rows neat and stubborn against the weather. A woodshed was stacked high and tight, the mark of a man who prepared for winter. Everything spoke of order, of a life measured and controlled. It was a human farm, solid and square, built of fieldstone and timber that had settled into the landscape as if it had grown there. It was not a place that looked like it had room for the broken things of the world. Grusha's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her own half-human blood felt like a betrayal to both sides of her heritage. To her former mate, Gorak, it had been a source of potent fertility until it failed. To the humans in the last village, it had been a source of fear, their eyes lingering on the slight jut of her lower canines, the solid frame of her shoulders. She was too much and not enough, all at once. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, she walked up the 3 stone steps to the door. Her knuckles were scraped and raw. She hesitated, then knocked, 3 times. Not the heavy, demanding rap of an orc, but the softer, questioning tap of a human beggar. The sound was swallowed by the rain. For a long moment, nothing happened. Hope, a thin and foolish thing, began to drain out of her, pooling with the rainwater around her feet. She was about to turn away, to gather her children and seek the cold comfort of the woodshed for the night, when a bolt scraped on the other side of the door. It opened. The man who stood there was tall and broad in the way of someone who works with the earth. His shoulders sloped with a permanent weariness. His hair was the colour of dried straw. His face was lined by sun and something deeper, a sorrow that had carved itself into the corners of his eyes and mouth. He wasn't old, perhaps 35 winters, but he looked as if he had lived each one of them twice. he held a lantern, and its light cast long, dancing shadows that made the hollows of his face seem immense. He looked at her, then at the boy beside her, then at the sleeping child on her back. His gaze was not unkind, but it was profoundly tired. It was the gaze of a man who had no more space in his life for trouble. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It held no welcome. "Shelter," Grusha said, the word barely a whisper. She hated the sound of her own voice, the pleading note she couldn't keep out of it. She forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his exhausted eyes. "Just for the night. The barn. We won't be any trouble. We can work for it." Cale pressed closer to her leg, his small body a rigid line of defiance against the cold and the stranger. The man's eyes fell to her son, and for a flicker of a second, the hard set of his jaw softened. He looked past her into the relentless rain, then back at her drenched form. He didn't ask where she came from or where she was going. The questions hung in the air, unspoken, and she was grateful for their absence. He simply stepped back, pulling the door wider. "The barn is for animals," he said, his tone flat. "Come inside." He didn't wait for an answer, turning and walking back into the house, leaving the door open as an invitation that felt more like a command. Grusha stood frozen on the threshold for a full 10 seconds, the rain plastering her hair to her skull. It was not the response she had expected. She had been ready for rejection, for a curse and a slammed door. This quiet, weary acceptance was something else entirely, something she didn't know how to navigate. Cale tugged on her hand. "Mama?" She looked down at him, at his pale face and wide, dark eyes. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. Together they stepped out of the storm and into the quiet house of Silas Blackwood. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and old grief. It was a clean smell, but a lonely one. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, its light pushing back the shadows in the single main room. The room was spare, functional. A long wooden table with 2 benches, a few sturdy chairs, shelves holding earthenware plates and mugs. Everything was scrubbed clean, meticulously ordered. Yet there was a stillness to the place, a layer of dust on things that were not essential for survival. In the corner, a large object was draped in a heavy linen sheet, its shape vaguely rectangular, like a silent, shrouded monument. Grusha recognized it as a weaver's loom. The sight of it, so still and covered, sent a strange pang through her chest. The man, Silas, gestured toward the fire. "Get them dry." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his attention already on the large iron kettle hanging over the flames. Grusha slid Alara from her back, the small girl stirring with a sleepy murmur. She unwrapped the damp blanket and settled her daughter on the worn hearthrug, as close to the warmth as she dared. Alara's eyes fluttered open, blinking in the firelight. She looked at the strange room, the strange man, and then up at her mother, her expression one of complete trust. Cale remained glued to Grusha's side, his suspicion a palpable force. Silas moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and a life lived alone. He took 3 mugs from the shelf, poured steaming water from the kettle into a basin, and set it on the table with a clean cloth. Then he ladled broth from another pot into the mugs. He placed them on the table, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He offered practicality, warmth, broth, a basin of hot water. These were things Grusha understood. Charity made her nervous. It always came with a price. But this felt like an exchange. He was a farmer, and this was the simple tending of cold, wet creatures that had appeared on his land. She was no different from a stray ewe that had wandered in from a storm. "There's a small room off the back," he said, his back still to her. "It was a storeroom. There are blankets. You can use it." He finally turned, and she saw he was holding a small, worn dress of faded blue homespun. He held it out, not to her, but in the direction of Alara. "For the little one. It was my daughter's." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Grusha took the dress. The wool was soft, worn thin with love and use. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. He just nodded, turning away again. A small girl, no older than Alara, peeked around the edge of an inner doorway. She had her father's straw-coloured hair and a pair of serious blue eyes that took in everything. She stared at Kale, then at Alara, her expression a mixture of caution and intense curiosity. She held a carved wooden bird in one hand, clutching it like a talisman. Silas saw her looking. "Lily," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "It's all right. Come." The girl, Lily, took a tentative step into the room, her eyes fixed on the newcomers. She didn't speak, just watched. Ilara, warmed by the fire and her own fearless nature, sat up and gave the girl a small, sleepy wave. Lily's solemn face broke into a tiny, hesitant smile, and she took another step forward. Keel, however, shifted to stand slightly in front of his sister, a small, stubborn sentinel. Grusha set about her tasks with the same quiet efficiency as her host. She stripped the wet, muddy clothes from her children, washed their faces and hands in the warm water, and dressed Alara in the borrowed blue dress. It was a little too big, but it was warm and dry. She wrapped Kale in one of the dry blankets Silas had left by the hearth. He accepted it stiffly, his pride warring with the bone-deep cold. Grusha drank her broth in slow, deliberate sips, letting the warmth spread through her. It was thin but savoury, and it was the first hot thing she'd had in her stomach for 2 days. The man, Silas, sat at the far end of the table with his own mug, watching the fire. His daughter, Lily, now sat on the floor a few feet from Alara, silently showing her the wooden bird. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the small sounds of children, the crackle of the fire, the quiet breathing of 4 strangers, and one lonely girl. It was a fragile, temporary peace, but for Grusha, it felt like a miracle. After the children were settled, she looked at Silas, ready to receive her instructions, ready for the bill to come due. "The wood for the fire is low," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I can split more in the morning. And I saw a section of fence down by the cabbage field. I can mend it." She was listing her skills, proving her worth. It was an apology and a promise. I will not be a burden. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. His tired eyes assessed her strong hands, her broad shoulders, the determined set of her jaw. He saw the exhaustion, but he also saw the resilience underneath, the deep grain of strength that had carried her this far. He had lived with loss long enough to recognize its shape in others. He saw it in the way she held herself, as if waiting for a blow, and in the fierce, protective watch she kept over her children. The wood is in the shed, he said simply. The tools are there too. We'll see in the morning. It was not a promise of a future, but it was the promise of a morning. For now, that was more than enough. He stood and pointed to the small door he'd mentioned earlier. The blankets are in the chest. Without another word, he took Lily's hand, and the two of them disappeared into the other part of the house, leaving Grusha and her children in the warm cocoon of the firelight. Grusha gathered her sleeping boy and her drowsy daughter, and for the first time in a long time, she led them toward a bed that was not the cold, hard ground. The next morning, Grusha was awake before the sun. The pale, watery light of dawn was just beginning to seep through the small window of the storeroom. Kale and Alara were still asleep, huddled together under a thick wool blanket, their faces peaceful in a way they hadn't been for weeks. Quietly, Grusha slipped out of the room. The main room was empty, the fire banked to glowing embers. A pot of water was already warming by its side. Silas was nowhere to be seen. She found him in the barn, his back to her, milking a single dun-coloured cow. He moved with a practised, rhythmic grace, the sound of the milk hitting the pail a steady, comforting beat in the morning quiet. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He just nodded toward another pail. The chickens need to be fed. Their grain is in the bin by the door. Grusha didn't need to be told twice. She found the grain, scattered it for the small flock of clucking hens, and collected 4 brown eggs from the nesting boxes. When she returned to the house, Silas was there, stoking the fire back to life. Lily sat at the table, carefully lining up 3 smooth stones. Grusha set the eggs on the table without a word. Silas glanced at them and gave a single, curt nod of approval. An hour later they ate a breakfast of porridge and boiled eggs in near complete silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but a working one. The children, however, were beginning to bridge the gap. Lily, emboldened by a night's sleep, slid one of her stones across the table toward Alara. Alara picked it up, examined it with great seriousness, and slid it back. Kale watched them, his expression unreadable, but he ate his porridge without protest. After the meal, Grusha went to the woodshed as she had promised. The shed was as orderly as the rest of the farm. Axes were sharpened and hung in a neat row, saws were oiled, and wedges were stacked by size. A large pile of unsplit logs lay waiting. Grusha chose a heavy splitting maul. The handle was smooth from use, shaped to a man's grip, but it felt good in her hands. Solid. Real. She set a thick round of oak on the block, took her stance, and swung. The maul came down with a satisfying thud, splitting the log cleanly in 2. She worked steadily, her movements powerful and efficient. The rhythm of the work was a balm, a way to silence the fearful voice in her head. Chop, stack, chop, stack. It was simple. It was useful. From the kitchen window, Silas watched her for a few minutes. He saw the clean, economical way she moved, wasting no energy. He'd seen men half her size struggle with oak that dense. He turned away from the window, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had assumed she was just a refugee, desperate and helpless. He was beginning to see he was wrong. She was not helpless. She was just without a place. Later that day, she moved to the broken fence line. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. A top rail on a 10-foot section of fence had been snapped, likely by a falling branch in a previous storm. Silas had propped it up as a temporary fix, but it wouldn't hold against a determined deer. Grusha found a discarded but solid length of timber behind the barn. She used a saw to trim it to size and a hand drill to bore new holes. Her work was patient and precise. It was a skill her human father had taught her long ago, a memory from a time before she had been taken to Gorak's clan, a time when she had been just a girl who liked to build things. As she worked, the children played nearby. Lily, it turned out, was as quiet a child as Silas was a man, but she had a fierce, imaginative inner world. She showed Ilara and a still reticent Kale how to build small houses out of twigs and moss. Kale at first stood apart, arms crossed, the little man of the family. But Ilara's delighted laughter was infectious, and soon he was on his knees, helping Lily find the straightest possible twig for a roof beam. Grusha watched them out of the corner of her eye, a small, tight knot in her chest beginning to loosen. When she had hammered the last wooden peg into place, she stood back to inspect her work. The new rail was level and tight. It would hold. She turned and found Silas standing a few feet away, holding 2 mugs of what smelled like weak, hot cider. He had approached so quietly she hadn't heard him. He held one out to her. She wiped her hands on her trousers, suddenly self-conscious, and took it. "It's good work," he said, looking at the fence. "Straight and solid." The praise was simple, unadorned, but it landed in her chest with the warmth of the cider. It had been a very long time since anyone had praised her for her strength, for her skill. With Gorak, her worth had been measured only by what her body could produce. She looked down at her hands, calloused and capable. They were good hands. "My father taught me," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. He just nodded, sipping his cider. They stood there for a minute in comfortable silence, 2 people who understood the language of work better than the language of words. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, spilling pale gold light across the fields. For the first time since she had been cast out, Grusha felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever. A tiny, fragile sense of peace. And as she looked over at her children, playing together in the weak sunlight, she allowed herself a small, hesitant smile. Silas saw it, and he thought, for the first time in over a year, that the silence in his house might not have to be permanent. One day bled into the next, and the arrangement, unspoken, solidified. Grusha and her children remained in the small storeroom, but they spent their days in the life of the farm. A week turned into 2, then a month. A routine settled over them, as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Silas would rise first, tending the animals. Grusha would follow, starting the fire and the morning meal. They worked through the days, rarely needing to speak to coordinate their tasks. She repaired the chicken coop, cleared the stones from a fallow patch of land he intended to plant in the spring, and organized the barn with a fierce, methodical tidiness that left him secretly impressed. He, in turn, was a patient teacher, showing her how to properly mulch the cabbage against the first frost, how to read the sky for the next day's weather. They were a good team. Their shared labor was a conversation, their respect for each other's competence a growing bond. The house itself began to change. The children were the agents of that change. Ilara's bright, chattering voice filled the quiet corners. She would follow Silas around the barn, asking endless questions that he answered with a surprising, gruff patience. Lily, who had been a solitary moon orbiting her father's grief, was drawn into Ilara's sunny gravity. They became inseparable, their whispers and giggles a new kind of music in the still rooms. Cale remained the most watchful. He orbited the new family structure at a careful distance, his loyalty to his mother absolute. He studied Silas with a solemn intensity, weighing his every action. He saw the way the farmer always made sure Grusha had the first serving at dinner. He saw the way he'd left a small pile of soft, easily carved basswood near the hearth after he noticed her whittling a toy for Ilara with a piece of hard oak. These were small things, quiet gestures, but Cale was a collector of details. One evening, as Silas was mending a leather harness by the fire, Cale approached him. He stood before the man, straightened his shoulders, and said, "My mother is a good fencer. She can build better than any man in our old clan." It was both a statement of pride and a warning. Do not underestimate her. Do not mistake her for weak. Silas looked up from his work. He met the boy's serious gaze. "I know," he said, his voice low and even. "She is." That was all, but it was enough. From that day on, Cale's watchfulness softened. He began to talk to Silas, asking him about the crops, the tools, the names of the birds that nested in the eaves of the barn. He started to put down roots. One cold night, as sleet rattled against the window panes, Ilara woke up coughing, her small body hot with fever. Grusha sat with her, bathing her forehead with a cool cloth. Silas came in with a steaming mug. "Mullein tea," he said, setting it down. "It will help her breathing." He stood by the hearth, a silent, worried sentinel, until the girl's breathing eased and she fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, Grusha found that their things had been moved from the storeroom into the house's second bedroom, the one that had clearly been Lily's. Lily's few belongings were now in her father's room. On the bed in their new room, 2 child-sized mattresses, stuffed with fresh straw and covered in clean linen, lay side by side. There was no discussion. It was simply done. That night, for the first time, Grusha slept under the farmer's roof, not as a temporary worker, but as a member of the household. The house was warming, thawing from the inside out. The most telling sign was the loom. It remained covered in the corner of the room, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It was just a piece of furniture, waiting Sometimes Grusha would see Silas look at it, his expression less pained, more distant, as if remembering a person and not just a loss. She felt a growing sense of safety, a feeling so foreign it was almost frightening. A heart, she thought, was not a cup that could be simply emptied of sorrow and refilled with something new. It was more like a field where the roots of what was lost remained, and new things had to find their space to grow alongside them. This fragile piece was so new, so precious, that she was terrified of it breaking. She knew Silas was a good man, but she did not understand him. She did not understand his quiet generosity, his acceptance of her and her children without question or demand. One evening, after the children were all asleep, they sat by the fire, the only light in the room. The wind howled outside, but inside it was warm and still. Grusha was darning one of Keel's socks, her hands moving with practiced skill. Silas was sharpening a blade, the scrape of steel on stone a steady, meditative sound. "Why?" she asked, the single word dropping into the quiet. He stopped his work, looking at her across the flickering space between them. "Why what?" "Why did you let us stay?" she clarified, her voice barely above a whisper. She did not look up from her sewing. "You had no reason to. I am what I am. I have 2 children. I am no use to a farmer." The last words were Gorax, and they came out tasting like ash. Silas set the stone and blade down carefully on the hearth. He was quiet for a long time, choosing his words. "My wife, Sarah, she died a year ago," he said, his voice flat with the effort of holding emotion at bay. "Birthing fever. The baby died with her." He looked toward the shrouded loom. She was the one who filled this house, was noise, was colour. She wove the curtains. She sang while she worked. After she was gone, there was just silence. He looked at Grusha then, his gaze direct and honest. Lily was lonely, and the house was too quiet. You and your children, you broke the silence. He paused. "And you are useful. You are strong, and you are smart, and you are a good mother." He picked up his blade and stone again, as if the conversation was over. But Grusha had one more question. "What if I can't give you more children?" The question was a stone in her throat. The shame of her barrenness was a physical weight. Silas looked at her, and his expression was not one of pity, but of a deep, shared understanding of loss. "I don't need more children to bury," he said, his voice rough with a pain he rarely showed. "I need help raising the one I have." The words were so plain, so devoid of romance or sentimentality, but they were the most beautiful words Grusha had ever heard. They were the truth. That night, as she lay in her bed listening to the steady breathing of her children in the next room, Grusha allowed herself to believe that she might have finally found a place to land. A place where her worth was not measured by her womb, but by her hands and by her heart. The quiet season of their new life lasted through the first snows and deep into the heart of winter. The farm was an isolated world, a pocket of warmth and routine sealed off by the cold. Grusha learned the rhythms of Silas's life and he learned hers. She discovered he had a dry, understated sense of humor that appeared in rare flashes. He learned that she had a deep, untapped well of knowledge about herbs and wild things, another gift from her human father. The children thrived. They were now a single unit of three, their loyalties intertwined. Cale had become a solemn apprentice to Silas, following him on his rounds, his young face serious with the importance of his tasks. Lily and Alara had created a world of their own, one of kings and queens who lived in snow forts and ruled over armies of twig people. One evening, as Grusha was banking the fire for the night, she began to hum. It was an old tune, a human lullaby her mother had sung to her, one she hadn't let herself remember in years. Gorak had hated her human songs, calling them weak and worthless. The tune came back to her unbidden, a ghost on her lips. Silas, who was reading a farmer's almanac by the last of the candlelight, looked up. He didn't speak, but his eyes softened, and he went back to his reading. He had given her a space where her own songs could return. It was during a rare trip to the village for supplies that the past finally caught up to them. The village was a small cluster of stone buildings, a half-day's walk from the farm. Its people were wary but not unkind. They had grown used to the sight of Silas, the quiet, grieving farmer. They were still adjusting to the sight of him with a half-orc woman and her 2 children. There were whispers, of course. Grusha felt the stares on her back, the way mothers pulled their children a little closer when she passed. She ignored it, holding her head high, her focus on the list of supplies Silas had given her. As she was leaving the general store, a voice called her name, a voice she had prayed she would never hear again. Grusha. It was deep, resonant, and carried a tone of cheerful ownership. She froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She turned slowly. There, standing in the muddy street as if he owned it, was Gorak. He was not as she remembered him from the day of the breaking, his face contorted with rage. He was smiling. He was dressed not in orcish leathers, but in well-made human clothes, a heavy wool coat, clean boots. He looked respectable, civilized. 2 other large, grim-faced orcs from his clan stood behind him, their presence a silent threat. "I have been looking for you," Gorak said, his voice loud enough for the gathering villagers to hear. He spread his hands in a gesture of benevolent reason. "A misunderstanding, a lover's quarrel. You ran off in anger. But it is time to come home. The children must be returned to their father, to their clan." Grusha's hand instinctively went to Cale and Alara, who were half hidden behind her skirts. Cale's face was a pale mask of fury. Alara began to cry. "We have no home with you," Grusha said, her voice shaking but firm. "You broke the bond. You cast us out." Gorak laughed, a rich, rolling sound that held no humor. "Ah, the rite of breaking. A formality, a bit of theatre, to teach you a lesson about gratitude." He took a step forward. "It has no meaning in these human lands. Here, I am simply a father looking for his children." He was playing a part for his audience, the concerned patriarch. He knew how humans feared orcish custom, and he was using their ignorance as a weapon, reframing a brutal act of expulsion as a quaint harmless tradition. They are my children, my blood. You have no claim, he said, his eyes glittering. He pulled a rolled parchment from his coat. I have a writ signed by my clan elder. It affirms my patrimony. He was polished, prepared. He had anticipated this. He had come not with brute force, but with the appearance of law on his side. Grusha felt the trap closing. The villagers were murmuring, their suspicion of her hardening into certainty. They saw a large, respectable-looking orc, speaking their language, holding a document. And they saw her, a strange half-breed with frightened children. The math was simple. Silas appeared at her side so quietly she started. He had been loading sacks of flour into the wagon. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, a small, public gesture of alliance that spoke volumes. He looked not at Gorak, but at Grusha. "Is this the man?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, unable to speak. Silas then turned his gaze to Gorak. He did not look intimidated by the orc's size or his two silent companions. He simply looked at him with a farmer's steady, measuring gaze. "She is under my protection," Silas said. The words were plain, without threat or bluster. "And this is my farm. You are not welcome on it." Gorak's smile tightened. "This is not about your farm, human. This is a clan matter, a family matter. It does not concern you." "The children live under my roof," Silas countered, his voice as unyielding as bedrock. "That makes it my concern." The standoff was broken by the arrival of the town reeve, a small, fussy man named Thomas, whose authority was derived entirely from a large book of rules he carried everywhere. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" he demanded, puffing out his chest. Gorak turned his considerable charm on the reeve. He explained his situation with practiced sorrow, the concerned father whose hysterical wife had fled with his beloved children. He presented his parchment with a flourish. Reeve Thomas took it, peering at the orcish script with a baffled expression. "This is a matter for deliberation," the reeve declared, eager to move the confrontation to his office, a place of ink and order. "My office, tomorrow, 10 o'clock. We will resolve this according to the laws of the territory." Gorak agreed with a magnanimous bow, casting a final, triumphant look at Grusha. He believed he had already won. He had documents. He had witnesses. He had the weight of tradition. What did she have? A silent farmer and 2 frightened children. As Gorak and his guards strode toward the inn, the villagers dispersed, their faces a mixture of fear and judgment. Grusha stood trembling in the street, the strength draining out of her. Silas's hand was still on her shoulder, a warm, solid anchor in a world that was threatening to wash her away. "He can't take them," she whispered, the words a prayer. "He can't." Silas looked down at her, his face grim but resolute. "He won't," he said. "Tomorrow you will tell the reeve your story, the truth of it." "No one will believe me," she said, her voice choked with despair. "They'll believe him." "I will be there," Silas said simply, "and I will believe you. We start there." He gently guided her and the children toward their wagon, away from the prying eyes of the town. The ride home was silent, the winter landscape outside matching the cold dread in Grusha's heart. The Reeves office was a small, cramped room that smelled of dust, old paper, and beeswax. Reeve Thomas sat behind a large, cluttered desk, looking important. Gorak and his 2 clansmen stood on one side of the room, radiating an aura of confident power. Grusha stood on the other, with Silas beside her. Kale and Alara were with a neighbour, a kind-faced, no-nonsense widow named Martha, who had taken them in without a second thought, pressing a warm biscuit into each of their hands and telling Grusha to speak plainly and fear nothing. The advice felt impossible to follow. Gorak spoke first. He was magnificent. He spoke of the sacred duty of a father, the unbroken line of his clan, the love he bore his children. He painted Grusha as a confused, emotional woman, her human blood making her unstable. He explained the rite of breaking as a solemn ritual of separation, not an expulsion, one that could be unmade with a simple apology and reunion. He was weaving a story that the humans could understand, a story of family drama, not of brutal patriarchal law. He presented his writ from the clan elder, which Reeve Thomas examined with a series of important-sounding hums. When Gorak finished, the room was silent. He had made his case, and to the Reeve, it seemed a strong one. All eyes turned to Grusha. She felt small, her voice trapped in her throat. She looked at Silas. He met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Speak plainly. She took a breath. My name is Grusha, daughter of Anya, she began, her voice low but clear. She did not look at Gorak. She looked at Reeve Thomas. I was Gorak's mate for 9 years. I gave him 2 children. She gestured to the writ. What that paper says is that he is their father. That is true. What it does not say is why we are here. She paused, gathering her strength. After my daughter Alara was born, the healer told me I could not safely have more children. The birth was hard. It broke something inside me. She spoke the words without shame, simply stating a fact. To Gorak, a mate is for one purpose, to strengthen the clan with sons. When he learned I was, in his words, barren, he no longer had a use for me. Gorak made a noise of protest. Lies and womanly hysterics. Let her speak, Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. The Reeve nodded for Grusha to continue. He performed the rite of breaking, she said, her voice steady now, gaining strength from the simple act of telling. It is not a ritual of separation. It is a judgment. He gathered the clan. He stood before them and declared me useless. He broke a ceremonial cord, symbolizing the severing of all ties. He took my clan markings from my arm with a hot knife. She unconsciously touched her forearm, where a faint, puckered scar lay hidden beneath her sleeve. And he cast me out, with nothing but my children. His exact words were, "Go and starve in the human lands. No one will want a broken thing like you." She stopped. The room was utterly still. She had not shouted. She had not cried. She had simply laid the facts out one by one, like stones in a row. The quiet cruelty of the act, described so plainly, was more damning than any accusation. Gorak's handsome face had paled. His performance was cracking. "These are the savage customs of a heartbroken woman," he blustered. "She twists our sacred traditions." Reeve Thomas looked from Gorak to Grusha. He was a man of paper and rules, but he was not a fool. He had seen the truth of her in her steady gaze, and he had seen the lie in Gorak's theatrical denial. He tapped the parchment on his desk. "This writ," he said, his voice dry, "is from your clan elder. It affirms your rights under clan law, does it not?" "It does," Gorak said, regaining his confidence. "Then we shall abide by it," the Reeve said. A slow smile spread across Gorak's face. Grusha's heart plummeted. The Reeve continued, holding up a hand. "The writ states that under clan law, you are the father, but you, Gorak, also performed a rite under that same clan law, a rite of breaking." He looked at Gorak over the top of his spectacles. "You said yourself it was a solemn ritual. By your own laws, you severed the bond. You declared her no part of your clan, and by extension, you forfeited your claim to anything that was hers, including the children she is charged to care for. You cast them out with her. You cannot, under the very laws you ask me to respect, now decide to reel them back in because you have changed your mind. As far as this territory is concerned, by your own sacred tradition, they are not your children to claim." Gorak stared, his mouth opening and closing. He had been beaten by his own weapon. His story had been dismantled by its own internal logic. "This is an outrage, a misinterpretation," he roared, his civilized mask finally falling away to reveal the tyrant beneath. "Silence!" the Reeve snapped, his voice surprisingly sharp. "You brought your law to my door. I have interpreted it. The matter is closed. The woman and her children will remain where they are. Now, I suggest you and your associates leave my town. Your presence is becoming a disturbance." Gorak stood there for a moment, his face a thunderous mask of pure fury. His two clansmen shifted uncomfortably. He had lost, publicly and completely. He turned, and for a second his eyes met Grusha's. She saw in them a pure, bottomless hatred. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and strode out of the office, his men trailing behind him. He didn't look back. It was, Grusha thought, the first honest gesture he had made all day. A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over her. She swayed on her feet, and Silas's hand was there, steadying her arm. "It's over," he said softly. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He just shook his head slightly. "You did it. You spoke the truth." They walked out of the Reeves' office and into the pale winter sunlight. It was over. She was free. The walk back to Martha's house was a blur. When the children saw her, they ran, Ilara wrapping her arms around Grusha's legs, Kale just standing close, his hand finding hers and gripping it tight. Martha nodded approvingly. Truth has a certain weight to it, doesn't it? Hard to argue with. She sent them on their way with a loaf of bread and a quiet smile. The journey back to the farm was the opposite of the journey in. The silence was not one of dread, but of peace. The world seemed sharper, the snow on the trees brighter. When they arrived home, the house felt different. It was not just a shelter anymore. It was a sanctuary. It was theirs. That evening, a quiet celebration was held. Silas opened a jar of spiced apple preserves that Sarah had made 2 summers before. He had not been able to bring himself to touch them until now. As they ate, he looked at Grusha. "The Reeve will draw up a paper," he said, his tone matter of fact. "A document of protection. It will name you as head of your household, and the children as your dependents, living on my land with my consent." It was a legal shield, a final wall against the past. But it was also something more. It was an acknowledgement, a formal binding of their lives, not by romance, but by shared responsibility and mutual respect. Weeks later, as the first signs of spring began to soften the hard edges of the land, Silas did something he hadn't done in over a year. He walked to the corner of the room and, with a gentle, deliberate motion, he pulled the linen sheet off the loom. The wood underneath was pale and smooth, the threads of a half-finished weaving still stretched across it, a pattern of blue and grey interrupted mid-row. It was a monument to a life cut short. He stood looking at it for a long time. Grusha watched him, her heart aching for the loss he had endured. She expected him to cover it again, to put the ghost back to rest. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was one that Cale had made for Lily, a copy of the one she always carried. Silas carefully placed the little bird on the weaver's bench, right beside the shuttle that Sarah's hands had last touched. It was a statement, clearer than any words. The past would not be erased or forgotten. It would simply have to make room for the present, new growth beside old roots. He turned to Grusha. "This house needs a family," he said, his voice quiet. It was not a question, but a simple statement of fact. "The children need a father, and I—" He faltered, the words not coming easily to him. "I do not wish to be silent any more." Grusha looked at this quiet, steady man. She looked at the home they had built together through a hard winter. She looked at the loom, where the token of her son's new life sat beside the relic of a past love. She thought of Gorak's words, that no one would want a broken thing. She had been broken, it was true. But here, in this quiet place, her broken pieces had been given a space to heal. Not to be made new, but to be made whole again, scars and all. "Yes," she said. The word was small, but it filled the entire room. Later that night, as she tucked a sleeping Alara into bed, she began to sing, her voice soft and sure. It was the human lullaby, the one her mother had given her, the song Gorak had tried to silence. She sang all the verses she could remember, her voice filling the warm, quiet house. A heart is not a cup that can be emptied and refilled. It is a field that once fallow can be planted again alongside what still grows there. And in the house of Silas Blackwood, the harvest was just beginning.